If you have a true, scary, or bizarre story you'd like to hear featured on the channel, then go to mariesfield.com and send it my way. And of course, thank you. Back when I was younger, my mom had a garage sale every summer. I had 3 older brothers, and I was the only girl, so hand-me-downs weren't really a thing for me. But after my last brother couldn't fit into those clothes or shoes, they were in the sale. I honestly enjoyed helping my mom on these, as it was like playing a real-life shopkeeper. I used to play that with my brothers a lot as kids. I also had the genius idea, like a lot of kids did, to sell lemonade and cookies too. When I got a little older, I think I was around 14 or 15, I was always trying to make my own money. So when my mom offered to give me the money I made on my stuff, I agreed to sell a lot more. I had some old clothes that I didn't want to get rid of, even though they didn't fit or were torn up. They held good memories, so I didn't want to part with it. I also had some toys that I didn't play with that I kept for similar reasons. My mom did not like clutter, so any extra stuff that wasn't necessary, she always tried to get rid of. So I pulled out all the stuff I didn't need anymore, and she set up a table specifically for my stuff, and they all had pink stickers, so we knew what belonged to me. I was ready to collect shopping funds. The sale started slow, but it was all right. I sat out there by the cash box, typically doing stuff on my phone, while my mom organized, put more stuff out, and mingled with the neighborhood shoppers. At one point, there was a guy that showed up alone in a small convertible. He looked normal. He was in jeans and a t-shirt, and just slowly made his way to each table and bin my mom had set out. He paused at the box of my dad's stuff, which I think had some old tools and shoes in it. Then he walked by the table that had my brother's clothes on it. He picked up a couple pairs of pants and looked like he checked the sizes, then folded them back up and laid them on the table. The next table had my mom's clothes and my clothes on it. He again picked up a few items, and one of those was a pair of my old jeans. I remember him holding them out and looking them up and down, almost as if he was inspecting them. Then he flipped them over to the back and kind of smirked. I figured it was because the back had something written across the pockets, like Angel. He looked around and noticed that I was making eye contact with him and smiled. I smiled back, then quickly looked back down at my phone, thinking it was awkward of me to stare. I knew it had been a few minutes because I had been watching a video that I was in the middle of. He walked over to me and said hello, and I responded. He asked if I was the manager, joking around, and I said my mom was, but I was just watching over as she got more stuff. He asked a few innocent questions about the day and me, but it was nothing weird, so I answered. I remember even making a comment about his car because I thought it looked cool. It was a deep purple color. He looked over at the car, then back at me and smiled, and said since I liked it, he could take me for a drive in it if I wanted. Now, even though he didn't seem weird or nothing felt off, I knew better, so I just smiled and said thanks, but no thanks. He then asked if I was selling any of my stuff, and I confirmed and pointed to the table as he had already looked at my pants. I also remembered this because I felt my stuff was pretty obvious. My mom was out there when he got there, and it's pretty obvious that we were 2 different sizes. The tables were also sorted out by type of clothing and sizing, as my mom was a neat freak. So he smiled again, thanking me, and walked back over to the table with my stuff. I snuck a few glances up from my phone to see him still looking at my clothes. I thought it was kind of weird that he was looking at my clothes and no one else's. But I also try to be reasonable in thinking maybe he had a daughter around the same age too. Then the guy came back over to me and had a few more questions, but this time they seemed a bit more intrusive. He asked how old I was, and I answered honestly. He asked me how tall I was, and I again was honest. But then he asked me what size I wore, which was weird because if I told you where my clothes were, you could check the sizes on them and assume I'm probably around that size. So I just told him the same size on the pants he was holding. He kind of laughed a bit, and I guess he could sense my uneasiness, and claimed he was thinking about his daughter. I thought it was still possible, so I just tried to be polite, but I was also feeling awkward at this point. He stood there for a moment, so I was expecting him to walk away, but instead, he leaned down towards my face, looked around, and then quietly asked, "Are you, getting rid of any of your old sports bras?" I wanted to yell at this guy, but I was also afraid he might try to do something. If he was brazen enough to ask me that with other people around, what else would he be willing to do? However, my dad was in the garage behind me talking to somebody as I could hear his voice, so I decided to take a chance and call this guy out. "No, I'm not selling my underwear to you, creep," I loudly shouted. This was the exact reaction I was hoping for. I looked back at my dad, who was already quickly walking towards the front. The guy dropped the items he was holding on the table in front of me and started walking away and looked at another table. He really thought he was going to be able to play that whole situation off. My dad immediately approached him, shoved him back a bit, and told him he needed to leave. No questions, no nothing. He just told him to GTFO our property right there. The guy walked back to his car, holding his hands up, and looked offended like my dad was in the wrong. He quickly burned out while other shoppers looked around at him and started asking questions. I explained to my dad what happened, and he made my oldest brother sit out there with me while he went in and told my mom. He didn't want me out there alone, nor did I want to be alone. It wasn't even that long after that they both came back out the front door. We were all talking and helping people pay and leave when I looked up to see a purple convertible driving by real slowly. Before I could even say anything, my dad looked up too and noticed and shouted something to the guy, causing him to take off. My brother was ready to go follow the guy in his own car, but my dad stopped him. Instead, he did call the cops to report him, which we did. They said they would drive around a few times, but said that if we saw him again, to call 911 immediately, and they could patch him to one of the officers so they could try to stop him if he was out front. At this point, he was being intimidating, and with what he said to me, and the fact that he was bordering on trespassing, they took it very seriously. We ended up putting all of our stuff away early because we didn't want to give that guy something to look at, but we didn't see him again after that day. However, my mom was going to try the sale again the next day, but I didn't want to be out there, so I ended up staying inside and cleaned and organized my room. And yet, that same creep drove by again. I was getting pretty worried, and every bump that night had me wide awake, thinking this guy was going to come back. My dad was getting pretty angry too. He ended up sitting in his car, parked on the street across from my house, and waited for that guy to drive by. My room faces out into the front yard, so I could hear him talking to my mom and brother about it while my window was open and could see him sitting in his car. I guess that must have really spooked the guy because he was brave enough to drive by one more time, and my dad was ready to follow him. I heard my mom shout, the convertible guy burned out again, and then my dad followed him. We had more cops over as my mom explained to them what happened. I don't know how long it was when my dad finally came back. He said he followed him for a while until he got on the highway, going some pretty dangerous speeds. My dad wasn't willing to humor that, so he slowed down and came back home. As far as I know, they never caught the guy, but we never saw him again after that. The conversation I had with him was creepy enough, but knowing he was driving past our home not only the day of, but the day after that encounter was pretty disturbing. It still creeps me out thinking about what his intentions were. But thankfully, we never saw him again after that. I just hope he didn't try to do that, or anything else, to another unexpected girl. A while back, I moved into a new apartment about 20 miles from my previous home because the company I was renting through was starting to hit a point where I couldn't work with them. I would mention something that needed to be fixed, they would ignore me, and then they would try to send the maintenance guys on days I worked without notice, and it was just a huge mess. It ended with me saying, screw it, finding a much smaller apartment and breaking my lease just to get away from their BS. Yes, I know this isn't the best way to do things, but I was fed up after living there for 4 years, and it wasn't showing any signs of getting better, so I was done. Moving into my new apartment was pretty simple. The complex staff seemed nice enough. I got into an apartment on the mid-level, and my boyfriend was able to help me move most of the heavy stuff. Once we got all the boxes into the apartment and got the furniture set up like it should be, I was pretty happy with how it all turned out. It was quite a bit smaller than my previous place, but it was also cheaper, and sometimes downsizing is necessary. I decided that I could spend a few years here, and if I didn't like it after that, I could go ahead and find another place. Plus, by then, if my boyfriend and I were still together, I was kind of assuming we'd be looking to our own place by that point. The first few days at my new apartment were great. I was enjoying setting everything up, and I was enjoying the new location, and even though I hadn't gotten the internet set up yet, I was spending my evenings replaying all my old games on my PS4 that I had forgotten about. One game in particular had been holding on to my attention for several nights, and that was Bloodborne. I've never really been into the Souls games, but I love the atmosphere in Bloodborne, and it was one of 4 games I had on disc, so it was the obvious choice. This may not sound important, but it actually is, because I had the disc in the console while I was playing it, as was necessary. The reason that's important is because one night when I got home from work, I sat on my couch and went to play it, but when I turned on my system, the first game on the list was The Last of Us. Now, I like The Last of Us, but I haven't played it for a long time, so I was a bit confused. I wasn't really sure what to make of it, to be honest, so I just switched out the disc and went on with my night. I mentioned it to my boyfriend the next morning when we were on the phone, and he made a joke about how I was probably going to play it at some point, put the disc in, and just forgot. That, or maybe I was sleepwalking, playing my PlayStation or something. I laughed and said that it had to be one of those because how else could it have happened? Again, it was weird, but I just accepted I forgot I put the disc in and moved on. That same night, when I got home from work, I noticed that my front door was slightly open. The doors to this apartment don't fully shut if you let them go, but it will shut most of the way, but the latch will not catch. It's a weird design on the door, but I think they were made this way on purpose to stop people's doors from accidentally slamming. I went to open it, but I kind of freaked out about the possibility of someone being inside my apartment, so I panicked and called my boyfriend, asking if he could come over. I told him that my door was open and that I thought someone may have broken in and that I didn't want to go in alone. He agreed, left work early, and came over. He opened the door, and we both slowly walked through the apartment, just cautiously checking each room. Nothing seemed really out of place. Nothing was missing, and all the lights were off, like I would have left them. After spending most of an hour checking things and being comforted by my boyfriend, I apologized for having him leave work early. He told me it wasn't a big deal, that he explained what happened to his manager, and that they wanted to be sure I was safe more than anything. After he left, I honestly spent most of that night crying and thinking I was going crazy. It was only the 2 events, but something just seemed off. I wasn't the type to do things and forget them. I wasn't the type to not lock my door. And I wasn't the type to be all panicky like this. I had no idea why I was freaking out so bad, and I think that was the worst part of all of it. The next couple days, I made notes of everything I did. I would text myself when I played a game on my console to make sure it didn't change. I would take a short video of myself locking the door when I left for work. I would document if I moved something to a new place. I was feeling a bit crazy with how obsessive I was over all of this, but I was doing this for peace of mind. Then, everything finally came to light on what was going on. I'd had a day at work where I was told to go home early because we'd had a number of clients cancel on us and I wasn't needed. It wasn't something that happened a lot, but it did sometimes happen. No clients meant no work and no money coming in. So it was easier for them to just give us half the day off than pay us for sitting around doing nothing for 5 hours. So I headed home, and when I got to my door, I noticed that it was cracked open again. As soon as I saw it, I stopped, stepped off to the side, pulled out my phone, and checked. Sure enough, there was a video in my camera roll that I took that morning, no more than 4 hours prior to that moment, of my locking the door and making sure it was locked. This time, I decided that I was going to call the office of the apartment and have them send one of their maintenance guys down. At first, they were a bit hesitant, but I asked them to just please send one of the maintenance staff over to check the locks because I was concerned for my safety. This seemed to work, and within a few minutes, one of the guys came down to my building. I met him at the front door, and I told him that I was a bit worried because this was the second time that this has happened. I told him that I had a situation a few days prior where my disc was changed in my PlayStation. I told him about the door being open, and I showed him that I was taking a video every single morning of me locking the door when I left. He looked at me like I was a bit crazy, but after explaining things a bit, he just kind of went with what I was saying. We went back to my door, and we both slowly entered, and at that point, my worst fears were actually confirmed. Right there, sitting on my couch and playing The Last of Us, was some random naked guy that I had never met. Obviously, there was a bit of a mutual freak out in this situation where I screamed, he screamed, and I pulled the door shut, telling the maintenance guy that I had no idea who that guy was. He laughed a bit, but then it kind of clicked that I was serious, that this guy had broken into my apartment and was sitting naked on my couch. He told me to go outside and call the police right away, and that he would hold the door shut to make sure this guy didn't leave. I did what he said, and while I was telling the cops where I was, I could hear this guy banging and screaming on the door, yelling about letting him out. Thankfully, the maintenance guy was a pretty big guy, and the person in my apartment wasn't going anywhere. The cops showed up and obviously arrested this man. Thankfully, he was clothed by this point. As they pulled him out, I confirmed with them that I had no clue who he was, but it was at that point that the maintenance person said he knew. He took me down to the office where we had a chat with a property manager, which was all part of the police report in the end. To wrap this up and explain what the hell had happened, this guy was a former tenant. In fact, he was the tenant that lived in my apartment before I moved in. When they had vacated, the apartment was empty for about 2 months before I moved in, and all the repairs and such were done in that time frame. There was, however, one item that somehow slipped through the cracks, replacing the door locks. This was something that they intended to do, but never got around to. So when I moved in, the lock was the same as when he lived there, which was pretty much just inviting him to come back and break in. Apparently, he hadn't actually wanted to move. He and his girlfriend lived there and they broke up, so when she left, he had nowhere to go. He decided to come and check out his old place because, of course, he still had a key, and wouldn't you know it, it all worked. I was at work during the day, so he had a place he could take a nap, play games, be comfortable in, and as long as he left before a certain time and made the place look the same as when he got there would be no issue. He had slipped up a few times, which I had noticed, and I caught him off guard when I came home early. As to why he was naked, I have no idea. I guess he just wanted to be really comfortable. Obviously, I worked out something with the property as this was a huge deal and a major violation of my safety. We changed the locks that day, and they verified that the only people that had the keys were myself and maintenance. They also were very apologetic about the whole thing, and I was pretty forgiving considering this mistake could have had an incredibly disgusting outcome if he had been more malicious. This was less than a year ago at this point, and my lease came up for renewal, and I did re-sign it. Changing the lockout was enough to guarantee this guy couldn't come back. Well, that and the charges he caught. Thankfully, I haven't had a problem since this whole event, though I am a lot more paranoid about locking my doors now. Growing up, I knew I was adopted. My parents were always very open about it with me and gave me as much information as they knew or could when I asked questions. They have and always will be my parents, but as I got older, I was curious about my biological parents. I wanted to know more about them, who they were, and what they looked like. Not to mention, I thought it was important to know any possible genetic and health concerns. So, with the information I was given by my parents and the adoption place they went through, I was able to learn more about my mother as she consented to be in contact by me if I wanted to. I spoke to my biological mother on the phone, and to my surprise, she was happy to hear from me. and the conversation just felt natural. Because of how well this went, I made plans to go and meet her in person. However, she lived in Utah and my family and I lived in Wyoming, so I made a solo road trip out of it. My parents were even happy for me and encouraged it. I was in a great mindset at the time. Things were going well, and I felt like I was both getting closure and filling holes in my life. It was a great day to be on the road. The weather was perfect, there was minimal traffic, and I was just enjoying the drive while also playing out different scenarios and making plans with my biological mother. However, as the sun was beginning to set, I started to become tired. But I guess because I was too excited, I didn't want to sleep yet. So instead, I stopped to get a bite to eat, hoping it might give me some energy to keep going. It worked for a few hours, but ultimately, I wasn't going to be able to avoid it. I had taken longer trips like this before on my own, and I didn't need much, so I typically slept in my car rather than getting a hotel room. I took the next exit and pulled into the parking lot of a store that was 24 hours. I felt those were at least safer, as there was always someone there, and in case I needed a restroom, I had one available. I actually did go in the store. I think it was like a convenience store, but not a gas station, as there were no pumps. I grabbed something to drink, used the restroom, and started heading back to my car. As I was walking there, I started hearing someone shouting from behind me. It was as if they were trying to get someone's attention, so it didn't sound alarming, scared, or angry. But since it was shouting nonetheless, I turned around to see what was happening. I saw a normal-looking guy, maybe in his 40s. His hair was long and stringy, and he also had a pretty long beard. He was wearing jeans and a denim jacket with a dark-colored shirt under it. And to my surprise, he was waving me down. I stopped to hear him out, and as he caught up to me, he asked if I had a cigarette. I apologized and told him I didn't smoke, and he seemed like he was trying to figure out something else to say or ask. He then looked at my hand as I was carrying my bottle of tea and asked if I had anything else to drink. The guy seemed completely normal, and maybe just a little down on his luck or something. Or hell, maybe he was just a mooch and trying to get anything he could for free. Either way, he wasn't being aggressive or annoying about it, so I pulled out the change I got from my purchase. I paid with a 10, so I had a 5 and some 1s that I just shoved in my pocket, and gave it to him. He smiled and seemed genuinely thankful for it, making a comment about how he would be able to get smokes and a drink with it. I just kind of smiled back and said something like, "No problem, man, enjoy your night." He waved goodbye and headed back towards the store. I then got in my car. I had parked close to the front, and then drove it to the back of the lot, parked, and then settled in to sleep for the night. I drifted off to sleep pretty quickly, but then I remember hearing what sounded like scratching. I was still in half of a sleep state and thought it was part of my dream. You know, the feeling kind of like when you hear your alarm in your dream. But then when the sound became faster and a bit louder, it finally jolted me awake, and I looked around to find the source of the sound. It didn't take me long to figure it out, because when I looked over at the passenger door, I saw the same guy from earlier messing with my door handle. I turned on my cab light and cracked the window on my side, the driver's side, and asked him what he was doing. The guy didn't even jump or look away from the handle when I did this, so I knocked on the passenger window to get his attention. He finally looked up at me, and with a deadpan look on his face, he asked if I would let him in so we could talk. However, something seemed off. The monotone way he said it and how he was persistent on trying the door put me on edge, so I didn't unlock the door or anything, but I did ask what he wanted to talk about. He refused to answer. He just kept saying in the same robotic voice, "I just want to talk about things. Please open the door." Again, that uneasy feeling was still there, and even though I gave this guy some money, there was no way I was going to let this stranger in my car in a small enclosed area. I told him I couldn't and that I needed to sleep, but he just shouted no at me and continued trying the handle, but getting more aggressive with it. After this going on for a few minutes, trying to figure out what I could do to get him to leave, I decided it best to just leave. I put my keys in the glove box, and as I went to grab them, this guy's demeanor completely changed. He began kicking the door and slamming into the window. I could see it slightly bend and began to worry he would actually manage to break it. With my hands now shaking, I tried to put the key in the ignition and start the car. I managed to get it started and burned out before he could break the window at least, but I had to get around a median to leave, which unfortunately gave this guy enough time to pick up a rock, chuck it at my car, and unfortunately caused my rearview window to crack. I got out of that parking lot and saw the guy in the mirror chasing me for a second until I reached the intersection. I had only been asleep for about 2 hours, but with my heart now racing, I was fully awake and decided to not stop driving. I didn't stop until the sun came up, to which I finally took a break at a McDonald's. I called my parents from there and told them what happened, but tried keeping it lighthearted so as to not worry my mother. After talking to them in a quick meal, I was feeling more grounded and got back on the road to finish my drive. I arrived at my biological mother's home after that with no incidents, and I also didn't stop again, other than for the normal food or restroom break. Obviously, I don't know what that guy's intentions were, but because of that feeling that wouldn't go away, I can't help but feel it wasn't going to be to ask for more money or an innocent conversation. The fact that his demeanor changed within a second terrified me. Even more so, I was just glad I got out of there before he was able to get in, and even more thankful that I woke up to the initial sounds. So that, my friends, was another scary story collection. Kind of a mix of stories here, so all creepy, actually. People being weird this time around. Not a fan of it. In fact, the guy in the parking lot one it kind of reminded me of the guy that stopped us when Raven and I went to see his sister in a nearby town before she moved like several states away. This was back when we were, 16, 17, I think, because I think we were both still in school. The area that she used to live in was very, I don't even know how to describe it. It was kind of run down, but also very popular to the artist crowd, I guess. I don't know. Either way, we were trying to find her place because it's a very complicated looking place, and I'm not a fan of it. It's overwhelming to me. But there's this guy that was just like walking down the street, and he flagged us, and we rolled down the window halfway, and he asked us for the location of some place. And I think we were both like, I don't know, because we're not from this area. In fact, we were trying to figure out where we were going. And then he's like, oh, okay, cool. Can you give me a ride? And we're like 16, 17-year-olds. No, we're not going to give you a ride, sir. Go away, please. that was it. He wasn't mean or anything. It was just kind of weird. And after that, we were just like, yeah, no, unfortunately, we're trying to find somebody that we have to meet up with. And he's like, okay, cool, and just like walked away. He reeked of alcohol because he was over on the passenger side on my side, but that was about it. Yeah, no, sorry if you come up to me, random person like that. I probably won't give you a ride. I'm sorry, but I do wish him well. So that's my story. If you did enjoy this video, please do give it a like below. And if you'd like to hear more content like this, consider subscribing. And lastly, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know your thoughts on the stories, the video itself. If you have any suggestions, let me know how you hang your toilet paper. Is it over or under? And yes, there is a wrong and a right answer to this. And with that being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day and a wonderful rest of your week. And until next time, take care.